Everyone, it's a pleasure to be here for a few minutes today. I'm going to try and actually probably talk less and then answer questions more. And I'm happy to switch that up a little bit. We spent most of the day today where you all were hearing folks talk a little bit about their organizations and the enterprise that they're starting with today. But I have a quick question for you all first. How many of you all know the big idea for the organization that you want to start tomorrow? So when you leave here today, you know tomorrow this is the organization I was waiting to start, and now that I've been here, I know exactly what I need to do it. How many of you all have that idea already? Okay, a couple, which is good, and that's fantastic. And I think there's been some great conversations today, but it looks like 95% of the crowd is still trying to figure out what that thing might be. And essentially what I wanted to talk a little bit more about today, and I'm happy to talk with people about the various organizations that I've been a part of more later, is about the people behind those organizations. Because while these organizations are doing fantastic things and are changing people's lives and are changing those individuals' lives that are leading them, most of us aren't necessarily at the point where we know exactly what that idea is. And even if we do have an idea today, we may well have another idea that's different in a week. And so the narrative of the entrepreneur is something that actually quite interests me as opposed to the narrative of the enterprise, especially as we think about what we actually as individuals want to do next. So first, my brief story. I'll give it very quickly. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee in the United States, and ended up on a kind of unusual scholarship that I went to two rival universities at the same time, one called the University of North Carolina and another one called Duke. At one point had infamy for actually sneaking into a Duke basketball game wearing UNC apparel, and they ended up chasing me out, and the security guards had to save me. But the other thing that I had a lot of fun doing there was creating a major that I created myself called the Dynamics of Social Change that looks at how individual decision-making drives social movements. I've never been one for following rules, so the university didn't actually want me to create the major. They said that it wasn't grounded and that I was just taking a bunch of random courses that looked really cool. In some ways, that was true. But importantly, I was doing it because I felt like networks of knowledge were more and more important. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes, but this idea that taking a whole bunch of different perspectives on one thing instead of learning a whole bunch in just one specific area, I think is more and more relevant in today's world. I left that, and the first jobs that I had, essentially I worked as an auditor is the word a friend of mine used today, on behalf of big philanthropic foundations. They would essentially have me go in and see whether the people that they were giving money were spending it well. And so I lived for a while in Southern Africa and did that down there. I went to New Zealand and did the same thing. But I got more and more frustrated with the nonprofits that I was working with because I felt like the impact they were trying to have in the world was separated from where they were getting revenue. And as a result, they couldn't scale to the scale of the problem they were trying to solve because ultimately the impact they were having didn't mean they would have more money to keep having more impact. So then I ended up going to McKinsey & Company, a big consulting firm, because I figured this whole idea of business is interesting. The nice thing about businesses is that you're getting paid for what you're doing, and that means you have an ability to get bigger much more easily. I realized I didn't know anything about business, and McKinsey essentially helped teach me that. In parallel, I started getting more and more involved with this idea of social enterprise, not because I thought that it was sort of this perfect concept, because I was intrigued by ways that you could actually create value for someone and demonstrate that value by their willingness to give something back, whether that's actually through compensating you or it's sharing information that you could sell to someone else or a whole range of things. So I started this organization called SEEDS, which stands for Social Entrepreneur and Enterprise Development for Students, that essentially helped to educate particularly students in American universities on opportunities to use social enterprise to try and solve the problems they were most passionate about. And then I now work at a company called Climate Bridge, which for me is sort of the blending of those two things. It's a very successful company. We recently raised another round of capital from a big private equity player that people have heard of before. But at the same time, every unit of revenue that we generate for the company is directly tied to an environmental impact trying to mitigate the effects of climate change. And linking those two things is something I got really excited about. So how many jobs do you all think that you all will have over the course of your lifetime today? Not too long ago, the answer was pretty low, but I'm curious. Raise your hand if you think you will have one job at some point. Presumably, most of you all will work at some point. Go ahead and raise your hand. I think that should be everyone if you think you will have at least one job. You think at least 2 jobs? At least 3 jobs? At least 4 jobs? At least 5 jobs? At least 6 jobs? So we're now looking at 4, 5, 6. Actually, now people actually estimate that it's 10 in most of the developed world. I couldn't find good statistics on mainland China. We'll call Hong Kong somewhere in between, I guess. And what's interesting to me is this concept that people are having more and more professional opportunities. And I'm going to just share 3 stories of regular people that I think demonstrate this idea that actually many of the world's greatest innovators today are not people who knew exactly what they wanted to do when they were born and did it for the rest of their lives. They're people that have been exploring and actively engaging with a whole range of issues, and in the process have found ways to have all sorts of different impacts. I stole these from their Facebook profiles because they're friends of mine, so they may or may not be proud of the fact that I'm sharing these pictures in a public setting. Derek Ng grew up in Shanghai and sort of took a relatively traditional path through university, got a degree in engineering, but was interested in thinking about ways that he could have more of an impact on rural development in China. To start to get an education in that, he actually went to McKinsey. He felt like the reputation that he could build there and the brand that he could build there was something he could use in other settings. A relatively traditional path in some ways. What he did that was a little bit different is he started doing more and more work on studies that didn't generate as much money for McKinsey, but they were focused on economic growth opportunities in rural China. And got particularly focused on energy. He then used that to translate into actually moving to the United States, and he went and worked for a bunch of oil companies, actually, in Houston. Again, kind of not traditional for someone that you might think of as a world changer. But he leaped from there to working within their clean technology departments, then actually moved from there to Southern Africa and worked for a while in Malawi, before recently moving back to China, starting to work with this company that does investing in companies that are creating interesting ways to generate energy in rural China, especially in villages that haven't had access to electricity before. Now he's actually at Stanford Business School and trying to essentially build a greater amount of knowledge to blend the sort of development-oriented experience he's had so far with other bits. Ben Rudick is actually possibly going to walk in here at any given moment. He is American originally, grew up, did a bunch of things in finance in his youth, mainly because that was his sort of family's background, but was really, really interested in thinking about how to spur economic development in other parts of the world. And he got particularly interested in transferring technology between different developing countries, because he had this theory that actually the innovations that were happening here were more appropriate for other developing countries than the innovations in the West, where infrastructure was more developed and those kinds of things. He moved to China. He started a company that called SunDollar that essentially tried to bring Chinese solar water heaters to Latin America and other developing countries. It went really well. In the process, he caught the attention of a guy named Bill Schoenfeld, who is the CEO of a big company here called Asia Pacific Land, I believe, and now serves as the executive director of the Schoenfeld Foundation, which, amongst other things, runs a program called Excel that you may have heard of, which I believe stands for Empowering China's Social Entrepreneurship Leaders, and has been in this position of being able to try and do really, really interesting things to spur social entrepreneurship in mainland in the mainland China and Hong Kong. The last story I'll tell is this guy named Anjan Sundaram. He didn't have any big pictures on Facebook, so I couldn't get quite as high a quality on this one. Anjan was born in a town outside of Mumbai in India. It was essentially a fishing village. His father moved with a fishing company to Dubai before Dubai was big. This was 30 years ago. Imagine sort of Pudong, if you can think of Shanghai, except there's no Shanghai in Dubai at that point. It's just a big swamp with one building. He managed to come out of that situation to get into Yale University, got a degree in mathematics, discrete mathematics, in fact, which I cannot do, and then decided to get a one-way ticket to the worst place in the world, and decided at that point, given there was civil unrest, to go to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. While he was there, over the course of a year and a half, he first started working a lot with street children, helped them start their own businesses, then convinced those street children to contribute a portion of their profits to create a scholarship fund to send those street children, or some portion of them, back to medical school. Then in the process, actually moved from there to being the AP reporter in the Congo and bringing, at that time, the Secretary General of the United Nations around the country to try and understand more about what was going on. He leaped from that to a job with McKinsey again. I've been fortunate to get to know a couple people through there. Where he did work on energy efficiency opportunities in China. He's now in Rwanda writing a book writing a fiction novel based on African folktales to try and articulate stories of experiences of people in Rwanda that they had struggled to tell themselves because of the trauma they experienced that they had there roughly 17 years ago, I guess, at this point. I tell these stories not just to sort of say, wow, there's really amazing people out there, but because each of them, in some ways, has created a really interesting and very different set of experiences over the course of relatively short careers. None of those people is older than 28, and the youngest is 24 years old. The thing that I really like about what they're doing is that they all haven't sort of said, well, there's only one thing I'm going to do, which is great if you find that one thing that you want to do, but actually have recognized that they don't have the one thing they want to do, but that there's a range of really, really interesting opportunities that you can grasp and capture for short periods of time that give you a set of experiences that you can draw upon for whatever you decide to do for the rest of your life. I have this conviction that the world is getting more and more complicated, and when I use the word complicated here, what I mean is essentially that networks that cross over different sectors of the economy, of society in general, are getting more and more intertwined into problems. I look at climate change that I'm trying to deal with. It's a social issue, it's a political issue, it's an energy issue, it's a national security issue, the list goes on. And so having experience and expertise in a bunch of very, very different things is becoming more and more important over time. For me, I didn't necessarily know it specifically at the time, but originally I did a bunch of work on economic development because I thought it was fascinating and I wanted to try and have as direct an impact as I could. But I got frustrated with it, and I ended up going into strategic consulting because I wanted to try and get a bigger picture, to think harder about the different ways that I could work. In the process of doing that consulting, I identified that a bunch of companies were doing a really bad job of taking advantage of innovations around clean technologies. What those things then did is come together to create a really interesting opportunity for me as an individual, because of a diverse set of experiences, to build a company that helps businesses use sustainable technologies better in the developing world. And so what I wanted to come out of this today with is a question, which is, my expectation for most of us is not, or most of you, or for me even as well, is not that tomorrow we're going to know exactly how we want to spend the rest of our lives. I don't think that's what we need to know tomorrow, though. What we want to try and figure out by tomorrow is how can we make decisions that let us build a constellation of experiences that'll help us solve interesting problems over the course of our lifetime. And that's the question I'd pose to you, is not, can you go out and pursue your greatest dream that you've had all your life tomorrow? Because for most of us, we don't have the good fortune, the luxury of knowing exactly what that dream will be. Instead, what we have is a knowledge that we want to try and make a difference, that we want to try and have an impact over the course of our lives. And we want to make the little decisions today that'll let us do the big things over time. And so coming out of these sessions, seeing the great things that different people in this room are doing is intended to show a pathway to the kind of difference that you can make. But the thing to do tomorrow is think about, what is an experience that I think I critically need to have, something that I really need to learn, an idea that I really want to grapple with and try, or a problem that I want to try and figure out. And if you can find a series of those, even if they seem very, very different at the time, even if it looks to someone who's watching your career like you're bouncing all over the place, as long as you can end up creating an interesting narrative for yourself of how those things tie together to create an interesting story of your life enterprise of making the largest difference that you can, I think you can end up in a really, really exciting place. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mark. Does anyone have any questions for Mark?
Yep, over here.
So thank you for your presentation. It's very inspiring. I would like to ask you, since the company you're working is more focused on green gas emission, right, and the technology. So say, how do you, I don't know how long have you been in Hong Kong, but I'm always very curious because, for example, the aircon system in Hong Kong, the public area, you know, city bus, and all these things, they do have this kind of technology and carbon emission kind of things. But how is it different from mainland China, say in Shanghai? And is it something that you have already observed or interested in?
So I should qualify first that I make it to Hong Kong fairly often, but I'm based in Shanghai and certainly know the ecosystem there better. I think that if you look at a lot of the urban infrastructure in most of East Asia, Shanghai and Hong Kong included, it tends to be fairly efficient compared to what you see in legacy systems in other parts of the world simply because it's newer. And so if I compare, for example, subway systems here to those that you would find in Europe or in the United States, oftentimes they're significantly more efficient. I think the places that we're having the most difficulty now in China, particularly in the mainland I know better, is not necessarily on the very, very visible public infrastructure in urban areas. It's in privately owned or state-owned, potentially, manufacturing facilities that are far from the public eye and much more difficult to access because there's a real goal in Hong Kong and elsewhere to try and look green, and that tends to lead to a pretty good outcome, actually. Not perfect, there's always ways to improve. Where I'm finding that we can make the most difference is when we go to a cement factory in Hunan that no one's been to in 20 years except the people that are working there, and no one's really paying attention to today. I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, and I think there's certainly opportunities to try and build a better public infrastructure. I think that's probably not the area that we're doing the worst right now in this part of the world. I think it's relatively better, even if it could still improve.
Well, thank you, Mark, for your very inspiring presentation. Just a short comment, because one thing that we don't want to happen is, today we're all inspired, the fire's been ignited, and people all very excited. And tomorrow we go back, another week happens, and life comes back, and you just go back to what you do normally. And that's definitely what we don't want to happen. That's why we have you here. So my question would be, what's your advice for our audience here today? Say, I don't know anything about entrepreneurship, but I have this dream somewhere in my mind. I want to start my venture one day. What do I need to prepare? Are there a toolkit, or there are like things I need to do to get myself ready? What's your suggestion?
Sure. I probably have two answers to that. One very practical one is find at least 2 people in this room that you didn't know before you met them today and schedule to see them again after you leave to have another conversation. One of the most challenging things I find coming out of these conferences is that you don't actually have a next step. Even if you don't know what enterprise it is, find somebody interesting that you met. Say you want to have coffee next week. Those kinds of things will actually make a real difference in how well you can get yourselves to commit to doing something. The second answer to that is that, no, I don't think there's a toolkit. I don't think there's a strict list of things you need to know. If you look at those people's stories, they're all dramatically different. I think what the biggest challenge, or the answer that I would actually generally make to that question, is look at each opportunity that you have, or each opportunity you think you might be able to create, and ask yourself, if you were standing back and looking at that opportunity for someone else, would you think it was really cool? And if your answer is yes, it's probably something worth spending some time on. I think the risk that we find is that we're doing things because we think that's what we're supposed to do. And sometimes the things that we're supposed to do are also really cool. McKinsey is a pretty traditional path. I also had a really, really cool experience there that I think is a big part of why I am who I am today. But that doesn't necessarily mean that for another person, building a new enterprise, or starting to do some really cool design work, or focusing on how to educate a group of people in a different way than they've been educated before, or working with sort of both food poverty as well as food surplus, or creating a new solar system that uses simple, well, relatively complex materials, but ones that are hard to break at least, to try and solve a problem and increase efficiency in a system that right now struggles from creating a per unit cost that's low enough. These are all really, really interesting, but really, really different things. I wouldn't say that you should try and prescribe a certain way to get prepared, but what you can look at is, I knew, for example, that I needed to understand how private enterprise worked better. I went to McKinsey. I understood that I wanted to get a better idea of what it really meant to work in rural development. I ended up finding an opportunity to go and work with nonprofits that were targeting those regions. Think about the gaps in your experience and your knowledge that you think it would be really fun to fill. And as long as you make sure that you're keeping your learning curve as steep as it can be, I think you can end up in a really good place. Thank you.